Zach, do you want to take a look at the controversial statement that AOC made, which got some people's feathers in a ruffle, including Hassan Piker? I have mixed thoughts on this one.
Yeah, this is the exact kind of controversy that I think is hilarious, guys. I just rolled my eyes at it. I was at the grocery store with my girlfriend Salisa, and Gavin was like, bro, have you seen this? And I was like, oh my gosh, what could it possibly be? I opened it up and it's the most nothing burger non-story I've ever seen in my entire life. Disappointed to learn today from AOC's email list that reading the Communist Manifesto makes me an extremist. Come on, man. And that is a very uncharitable way to interpret what AOC has done here. She put out this email saying Fox News and the right wing would have you believe that that my American values are something out of the Communist Manifesto. But I don't believe in healthcare, labor, and human dignity because I'm an extremist. I believe these things because I was a waitress. And the whole point that she's trying to make, guys, is that these are not fringe ideas, that these are, you know, neighborly concepts. You remember how we praised Tim Walz for talking about how his ideas aren't radical, they're not socialism, they're neighborliness, right? It's neighborly to take care of your neighbor's children and help them get breakfast. It's neighborly to make sure that you're not killing the environment. It's neighborly to make sure that people have, good food and healthcare and all of those kinds of things. That's what AOC is trying to do here. And you have to be terminally online to find a way to, get frustrated by this, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Ghost Dog TV put it well. I mean, I'm basically a communist, and I didn't get that way by reading Marx. 100%. I also basically consider myself a communist. I don't think there's all that much that Marx wrote or said that I hardcore disagree with, right? But the one time, I will admit, the one time I did actually try to read the Communist Manifesto, I got like halfway through it, and I was like, you know what? I kind of already agree with most of this. I don't need to read this, old book that is hard to understand and feels like I'm doing classwork, right? I was like, I kind of get the point. I already agree with this message. And I think most normal people feel that way, right? If they're led to leftism, it's not because they started picking through the pages of Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto. And I think that's really the point that AOC was making, more than trying to say that people who do read theory are extremists, which I think is the only issue with the statement, is the way it was phrased, right? Like, it does kind of make it sound like she's saying that people who do read theory or who do study Marx, that they are extremist. And I don't appreciate that, because I do think that feeds into a right-wing narrative about communism. I don't think it's a good idea to add to this like dog pile on communism as an idea, right? And we see this a ton. So I don't really necessarily think that was the right way to phrase it. But let's also take a look at this, Zach, because she also said this in a rally speech. So let's hear it directly from the horse's mouth and see if this is any different or if it's basically just the same thing in spoken form. Weird. Are you not hearing that?
No, I'm not hearing anything. Are you here? Yeah.
Weird. Either way.
Yeah, sorry about that, but it doesn't look like the audio is playing from that.
Either way, it looks like she basically does say the exact same thing here. I guess my only point, the only point I was going to make by playing the clip too, is that I don't know if she needs to make this like something she repeats over and over again. Even though it doesn't trigger me at all, like I said, I don't necessarily want like it to be seen as like communist bashing or something to become like a mainstay talking point in a Bernie or AOC speech. Does that make sense?
I hear you, and I like, as a leftist, like, I agree with a lot of the points that you're making, but here's the problem that I think that she's trying to overcome. Like, communism needs a rebrand in this country, guys. Like, unfortunately, you are going up against 60, 70 years of propaganda when you talk about the Communist Manifesto. And one of the most effective ways that the right wing has of debasing left-wing progress, of talking about how any single thing that is going to benefit the working class, they call it communism, right? And what I think that AOC and Bernie Sanders are both being really conscious about is getting out ahead of that. And if somebody on the internet gets their feelings hurt because they're like, I'm a communist and you're calling me a radical, it's
that's like, not the critique.
Most of Americans do think that that is radical.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily a fair, interpretation of the critique. I think at least my criticism of this is not that, oh, I'm so triggered because you insulted my hero, Karl Marx. Like I said, I didn't even get through the fucking Communist Manifesto. The energy that I don't like, that I disapprove of, is like agreeing to Republican framing when it's not even necessary. And that's not something the Republicans necessarily did, right? The Democrats called them fascists. They called them Nazis. And guess what the Republicans said? Yeah, we kind of are. And here's a Nazi fucking symbol in a campaign ad that you can all get triggered about and freak out over. Remember when Ron DeSantis did that? Oops, there's accidentally a Nazi symbol in my ad. And then, Trump people go out there and make dog whistles to their far right fringe. Democrats don't do that. They shit on their far left fringe every single time. They always want to, distance themselves, and they never want to lean into their more edgy or radical base elements. And generally, I do think that's a good idea. My only point is that I don't think this should become a mainstay talking point. I don't think that communism bashing or, calling Marx an extremist should become a mainstay talking point on the campaign trail when you're trying to raise class-based awareness. You can't deny that Marx did get the stuff right. Like, maybe your average person does think he's a crazy guy or something, but he was right.
Yeah, I just think that what she's trying to get across is I'm not an extremist. These ideas are not extreme. These ideas are normal. And I think that she was basically just playing on the fact that like conservatives constantly call her a communist. She's constantly lampooned that way on Fox News. And she's like, newsflash, these ideas are really popular. It's not because I'm some sort of a radical extremist. Right. And that's just the takeaway that I have. So I agree with you. If she does go on to like a campaign where she's like, the Communist Manifesto is extremism. But to me, that seemed like more of a throwaway line that one of her speechwriters wrote for her.
But then she sent it out in an email too. So it's kind of like, all right, now, so this is not only a speech thing, but we're also getting emails where you're calling Marx an extremist. I do kind of get why some people bristled at it, including Hassan, who put out this tweet. And I think, maybe part of the reason why he did, you guys might remember.
Here, I've got it right here.
We were watching the other day. He actually gave AOC a little pamphlet that was from the Japanese Communist Party, or maybe it was Bernie. He gave that. I think it was.
No, AOC. It was AOC. He gave Bernie the train, and he was going to give Bernie the pin, but he didn't have it.
There you go. Yeah, it was. But it was from the Communist Party of Japan or something that he had just visited. So he probably does have a renewed level of sympathy for communist movements. And it is true that when you go outside of America, to Europe or to somewhere like Japan, communism is not considered the scary, crazy thing. It's like there's a Communist Party of France. There's a Socialist Party of France. It's not considered this wild, radical thing. So Hassan, just after getting back from Japan, visiting those comrades, he was probably like, what the hell, bro? Like, these are basic, simple ideas that the rest of the world is, with it enough to understand is not some crazy radical screed. It's not like we're talking about the Unabomber's manifesto or some shit, right? That's almost the way AOC was talking about it. I believe in the environment, but not because I'm the Unabomber or some shit, right? Whereas Karl Marx, really not all that crazy. It's not like Karl Marx was a violent guy. He didn't believe in like extremism necessarily, from what I understand.
No, of course not. And again, what it really comes down to for me is the fact that unfortunately it needs a rebrand. And I think that's what AOC is trying to do. I think she's trying to rebrand it away from this like McCarthyistic bullshit. And one thing we also have to talk about is there has been like this really big push of neo-McCarthyism amongst the Democrat voters. And I think that has something to do with it here. I think they're trying to play chess, not checkers. And I agree they could take a different approach. But what they're trying to do is not scare off the people who have been fed a bunch of Russophobic bullshit for a long time. Oh my gosh, the rise of communist Russia. Like that was Maxwell Frost tweeting that. Jasmine Crockett was like, we're not going to collaborate with communist Russia.
Yeah.
Right. I think that is bad. And I think that is something that needs to be called out. I've called it out on the podcast multiple times. What I think that what AOC and Bernie are trying so desperately hard to do right now is to not alienate people who are vulnerable to those kinds of talking points from the Democratic Party, and still get those people to feel like they're a part of the opposition to oligarchy. And I think they're really trying to figure out how to thread the needle. And it might have been choppy, and maybe that wasn't the best line from one of her speechwriters, right? But I think that what she's trying to do is that same thing that Tim Walz was trying to do. And it's the same thing that Bernie Sanders has always tried to do by calling himself a democratic socialist instead of just a socialist, right? Because it elicits so much fear in the American people, right? If you go up to regular people in America who aren't online, who aren't directly exposed to the ideas of Karl Marx, which you guys have to concede would take a lot of political action, a lot more political action than most Americans have the time to take, right? So what she's trying to do is she's trying to divorce her very popular ideas from that very unpopular packaging, which is, oh, that's communism. Oh, that's, socialism. We've come a long way on the socialism. The communist thing really does still scare people, especially with the fact that Russia's invaded Ukraine and we're doing all of the saber rattling with China right now. It's just harder to sell these ideas that are really popular if you talk about them as if they're Marxism and not if you talk about them as if they're American values, which I think is what AOC and Bernie are trying to do.
Yeah, I do agree with that. Again, the only thing I worry about is the left falling into this trap where it's like, I feel like we're the only ones that ever have to take that advice, because the Republicans just spent the last, couple years talking about like how we should plagiarize the strategy of President McKinley and talking about these obscure theories of Curtis Yarvin and all this bizarre shit that you also think would turn off your average Joe, right? But they didn't have to come out here and distance themselves from their actual beliefs and their actual ideological founders' opinions constantly. They didn't do that, right? And it just seems like it's the left that always has to do that. Oh, don't worry, we're not crazy, we're not scary, we're not actually leftists. That's just how it kind of comes off, I think, to some people, where it's like, chill, bro. Like, you don't have to do that. But I get what you're saying. And largely, I do agree with you. That was my first reaction as well, where I'm like, I've definitely said the same thing on the show, right? I've said the same shit on the show, that most people, they don't come to leftism. They don't come to progressive ideas because they started reading theory, or even studying history, right? They come to these ideas and these principles politically because they run into them in their own lives. They encounter the experience of being exploited by a boss, or they encounter the hell of having to deal with an insurance company when you need it the most. And that's what radicalizes you, right? Any number of the daily experiences that people face when it comes to the oppression of capitalism and the institutions and even the government. That's what radicalizes people. It's not like, oh, I was at the library and in between reading cookbooks, I decided to take a crack at the Communist Manifesto, and turns out Marx did have some really good ideas, and that I totally get.
Yeah, no, I think you and I are largely on the same page. I think part of the reason it feels like the Democrats always have to acquiesce and always have to kind of find the middle ground is because it's seemingly the fact that they do, right? The fact that Bernie has strategized that way, it's led to his biggest crowd size ever. It's led to 36,000 people when the last time he ran for president, he was in New York City and he drew 28,000 people, right?
You think that's because they threw Marx under the bus?
No, I think it's because he's playing to the middle. I think he's playing to the mainstream, and I think it's because he's instead of.
I think it's because of how bad Trump is more than anything, honestly.
But do you think that if he was out here scaring the fuck out of NPR listeners and taking shots at every mainstream...
NPR listeners are ready to embrace a little bit of leftist extremism. I think that's also why his rallies are so big, is because they're like, you know what? Fuck Kamala Harris, fuck Morning Joe, fuck all these losers. Let's go where the real fighting revolutionary energy is. This guy was talking about a political revolution 8 years ago. He was right.
I hope that you're right, but to me, I think part of what it is the fact that he hasn't scared off these people with what those people would perceive as radicalism, right? Like Bernie Sanders seems like the kind of guy who understands procedure. Bernie Sanders seems like the kind of guy who has paid his dues. Bernie Sanders seems like the kind of guy who has made his way in Washington for decades, and I think that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting for people who are more MSNBC, CNN viewers, people who would have been perfectly happy with Pete Buttigieg or Amy Klobuchar or Elizabeth Warren in the last primary coming out to support him is because he hasn't alienated and scared them. And I think that what he's really trying to target in on who are the most likely people to participate in Democratic voting, right? Who are the people who are most likely to show up and vote? Because in the past, he really did, bet big on people who were first-time voters, people who hadn't paid attention to politics as much in the past, and he lost, right? So I think that part of his recalculation this time around is how do I make sure that I am winning and excelling and keeping people who are going to show up and vote on election day and keeping people who are going to continue to participate in this process, making sure that they're on the team too. Now, I disagree with a lot of those people's politics, but I think from a mathematics standpoint, there might be something to what Bernie Sanders is doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with that. And to be clear, Bernie didn't say anything about Karl Marx or the Communist Manifesto. True. This was AOC. So I don't really necessarily think it speaks to the enthusiasm for Bernie's rallies. And ultimately, I do cede your point. I ultimately do think that I agree with what you're saying. And clearly it is working. But I do think that it's still true that even those moderate MSNBC Democrats that are showing up to these rallies, they still do think of Bernie as about the furthest left option that's on the table in their in their eyes, as far as their Overton window is concerned, like Bernie is the most left-wing, revolutionary, socialist candidate that they would ever consider to be a viable option.
Yep.
And I don't think that Bernie should kill the part of him that made him appealing in the first place, right? Like that's what made you appealing, bro. Again, you're the guy that came onto the scene talking about a political revolution. So yeah, that's why people are now realizing you were right all along. It's not time to start, sounding like a normal Democrat. It's time to double down and be like, yeah, I was fucking right, bitch. Get in line behind me. But I also agree that, it's a fine line to walk. And I think Bernie's always walked that line, which is why you're right. He called himself a democratic socialist, not a socialist. That's why he called it a political revolution, not a fucking real revolution,
Oh, 100%. And I think we're pretty much on the same page. We can, debate the fringes, but I think that one of the other things that's true is that you're right. More mainstream liberals, more mainstream voters, people who are run-of-the-mill Democrats and not necessarily people who would immediately identify as progressive, they do want to see more gumption.
Look out the door if you hear an ambulance. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be there, sir. The Vanguard will be there. Be there.